I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's October 29th, and we have a lot to talk about. When I think about some of the remarkable MS research that's currently underway, research that's uncovering ways to diagnose MS even before symptoms develop, research that's zeroing in on potential vaccines for the Epstein-Barr virus, which may stop MS before it even starts, and research that's identifying how to restore function that's been lost to MS, I can't help but feel encouraged about the future. And I appreciate that these things can't happen fast enough. But I also appreciate that today, even with disease-modifying therapies that make it easier than ever before to manage MS, living with MS is still about living with loss. Now, sometimes those losses are small and in the grand scheme of things, not all that important. Other times those losses can be huge, life-changing. Now, the definition of grief is an emotional response to significant loss. So it's not unusual to grieve over the things in your life that have been lost due to MS. In fact, healthy grieving can play an important role in reevaluating and reprioritizing life, allowing you to move forward. Dr. Holly Hendin joins me today as we explore grieving when you're living with MS. Dr. Hendin is a faculty physician and psychiatrist at St. Joseph's Hospital Medical Group Outpatient Behavioral Health in Phoenix, Arizona. But before we get to my conversation with Dr. Hendin, there are a few other things that you should know about. In 2010, Dr. Ruth Ann Mary published the first paper suggesting that comorbidities, or other health conditions like diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, and high cholesterol, could increase disease progression and disability in people living with MS. Since then, Dr. Mary and her team have shown that various comorbidities affect all aspects of MS, including time to diagnosis, severity of disability at diagnosis, the use of healthcare, and mortality. Now, Dr. Mary and her team have published the results of a study that focused on the impact of comorbidities on MS disease activity, like relapse rate and lesion accrual. In this study, the research team analyzed data from 17 different Phase 3 clinical trials for MS disease-modifying therapies that included 2 years of follow-up. These clinical trials all took place between 2001 and 2018. Almost 17,000 people with MS were included, representing participants from 17 different clinical trials. The researchers cataloged a long list of individual comorbidities that were identified at the beginning of each of the clinical trials, including hypertension, hyperlipidemia, functional cardiovascular disease, ischemic heart, cerebrovascular and peripheral vascular disease, diabetes, autoimmune thyroid and miscellaneous autoimmune conditions, migraine, lung and skin conditions, depression, anxiety, and other psychiatric disorders. The outcome of this analysis was defined as evidence of disease activity over a period of 2 years. Now, that disease activity was defined as a confirmed relapse, disability worsening, or new lesions on MRI. The analysis showed that over a 2-year period, 61% of the people in these pooled clinical trials showed evidence of disease activity. Using mathematical models that adjusted for factors like age, sex, disability levels, treatment, and previous MS disease activity, this analysis showed that compared to people with MS without comorbidities, people with MS and 3 or more comorbidities had a 14% greater risk of experiencing disease activity. Drilling down a bit, this risk increased significantly by 21% in people with 2 or more heart-related comorbidities. This analysis also showed that people with at least one psychiatric comorbidity, like depression, had a 7% increased risk of MS disease activity compared to people with MS who had no psychiatric comorbidities, This becomes especially important when you consider that 50% of the people with MS are likely going to experience clinical depression. The research team wrote that these results, and I'm quoting now, suggest that the effects of higher comorbidity burden could be greater and have consequences for the clinical care for people with MS beyond the comorbidities. In other words, as these other health conditions have been shown to have an impact on relapse rate and disability worsening, managing comorbidities needs to be considered a part of MS care. This can get tricky for MS patients who, when they feel like something has changed, often attribute it to a symptom of MS. But that isn't always going to be the case. People develop comorbidities, especially as they age. So be sure that you're discussing new symptoms with your MS care team so they can be identified, necessary referrals can be made, and you can begin treating comorbidities before they have a chance to make your MS worse. Now, if you'd like to review the details of this study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. In past episodes of this podcast, if you've listened to some of our conversations about the Pathways to Cures research initiative, you might recall that one of the goals of this initiative is restoring lost function. The pathway to reaching this goal involves repairing the myelin that's been damaged by MS. And while there have been many efforts at myelin repair, so far they've only worked on the animal model of MS. They haven't been successfully translated to clinical trials. That's one of the reasons that the National MS Society has announced $4.6 million in funding that's going toward 5 research projects, all focused on myelin repair. A project at the University of Kansas will be investigating the role of cholesterol, which is a component of myelin. Many proteins are involved in how cholesterol forms and breaks down. The University of Kansas research team plans on deleting those proteins and determining whether they could be targeted to boost cholesterol recycling, therefore promoting remyelination. A project at Georgetown University will examine whether blocking a transporter of amino acids can ease the chronic inflammation in the brain that's believed to prevent normal remyelination from taking place. A research team at Johns Hopkins University will explore changes in fat metabolism that may affect the repair abilities of myelin-producing cells. Researchers at Case Western Reserve University will investigate how specific cells that support the survival of nerve cells, now these are called astrocytes, become overly active and contribute to damage in MS. This project is going to test a class of compounds that prevent the toxic activation of astrocytes, which may protect nerve cells, halting or even reversing the disability progression that occurs in MS. The 5th project at the Alicante Neuroscience Institute in Spain will focus on testing a brain protein that may help to activate myelin-producing cells that stop working when you have MS. Gaining a better understanding of why myelin repair stops in MS and discovering ways to restart that process are major steps toward restoring the physical function that's been lost to MS. We're watching this space closely as every experiment, every study, brings researchers closer to achieving that goal. When we talk about lost function, it's worth pausing to consider that, like all things in MS, we could be talking about a relatively minor loss of function, or loss so profound that it becomes completely life-altering. Grieving is a natural response to loss, and healthy grieving can be the first step toward reevaluating and reprioritizing life. It's that necessary emotional step that ultimately allows us to move forward. Joining me in a moment to discuss grieving when you're living with MS is my guest, Dr. Holly Hendin. Grief is defined as the normal response to a major loss. Now, that definition would certainly cover the sense of loss you might experience as a result of living with MS. But grief also allows us to survive change. For someone living with MS, grieving can play an important role in reevaluating and reprioritizing life. Joining me to discuss the idea of healthy grieving is Dr. Holly Hendin, a faculty physician and psychiatrist at St. Joseph's Hospital Medical Group Outpatient Behavioral Health in Phoenix, Arizona. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Hendin.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
I always like to begin discussions like this with some clear definitions. So, how do you define grief, and how does it differ from feelings like sadness or loss?
Yeah, great question. So grief is usually defined as a complex set of emotions that arise in the face of loss of a beloved person or thing. And usually, grief is more than just sadness or loss. There are so many emotions that are part of a grief reaction. They could range from anger, disgust, even acceptance, even sometimes hopefulness. So, although grief can involve sadness, grief is not the same thing as sadness. And as you mentioned, grief can be transformational. It really can. It can be something that creates positive changes, although it is not easy at all. It can, in the end, create something beautiful and transformative.
Grief seems like a very personal, emotional process. But are there any commonalities in how people experience grief?
Yeah, so grief is a very personal, a personal journey. Nobody experiences grief in exactly the same ways. Grief is a very human journey. It's usually a journey from love to loss. And just as none of us experience love in the same way or have the same love journey, no one has exactly the same grief journey. One of the hallmarks of grief is that it ebbs and flows and that it can be an iterative process. So in that way, there are so many iterations of so many different emotions that there is really no one way to grieve. And some people have numbness in response to grief. And so that's the hallmark for them. So I always want to say there is no one way to grieve. Everybody grieves in their own way, but there are people who have tried to encapsulate what grief could be like for many people. One of those would be Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who came up with these 5 stages that people go through when they are dying. And then she translated that into 5 stages people might go through when they are grieving. And those are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. She makes it sound like, although she, I think, would disagree, that it has to be, or even usually is, a linear process, but it certainly sounds like it's going to be a linear process. I would say for the majority of people, it is not linear at all. Like I mentioned earlier, it is iterative. There are so many other emotions that typically come up in the face of grief. And then I would say, beyond acceptance, as we mentioned earlier, grief can be transformational. So acceptance can lead into transformation, but I don't think that those are exactly the same things.
I have a feeling we have some very goal-oriented listeners who are thinking,
Yes.
okay, tell me exactly how long will it take me to get through these stages of grief and arrive at acceptance and experience my transformation? So what can you tell them?
Yeah, I would say I wish that things worked that way in our lives, that unfortunately, no matter how hard you work at grief, there really is no timeline. Grief may never ever go away. And I don't think that is necessarily a terrible thing. Grief brings with it the memory of the person or the thing that we are grieving. And we would certainly never want to lose the memory of that person, even if that person is ourselves, grieving for aspects of ourselves that are no longer possible or that we feel are not possible. And It's really, grief is a hard journey. It's full of a lot of difficult negative emotions, and trying to rush yourself through them just to arrive at some imagined finish line is actually a surefire way of not achieving transformation, not achieving a sense of peace or acceptance. It really is through kind of like slogging through the mud of the really kind of terrible, horrible, sad, negative emotions that can often accompany grief. So while I would say that there is no finish line, that while you are going through those terrible, sad emotions, please remember to keep hope, that you are not alone, that you are strong in going through what you're going through, facing what you're facing, and that recognition, that's the transformation. And it's kind of a paradox, but in your hardest moments, that might be when you actually recognize the transformation. It's not when you're sitting on the beach with a Mai Tai and looking at the sunset and thinking, wow, this acceptance phase is amazing. It could actually be in your darkest moments. Yeah.
Grief is an emotional response to loss. But at the time someone is diagnosed with MS, they may have experienced some MS symptoms, but they haven't yet experienced loss. So why might someone experience grief at the time they're diagnosed?
Yeah, the diagnosis of MS or any chronic disease that you imagine could be very debilitating and that comes with a high amount of uncertainty is a very scary thing. And when we are scared and when we are uncertain, we often tell ourselves stories. And I would say the majority of time that we tell ourselves stories, they end up not being entirely true. They are usually the scariest stories that we tell ourselves. And so in the face of a diagnosis of MS, I think that the grief is really this scary story that we tell ourselves that, we have this idealized, imagined version of ourselves that we are today or that we will be tomorrow or in the future, or this imagined future for ourselves. And there is a sense that this will never come to be because we have this diagnosis now. And that is where the grief arises. It is grieving the imagined self, grieving the self you think you are going to lose, grieving the people you think you might lose, grieving the jobs or successes that you think you might lose. And I think that although all of this is very valid, it's very real, it's very human, and I encourage you to feel everything that you are feeling, but you also, I think, need an anchor, somebody who is there for you, who is willing to talk to you about this and remind you that these are stories that you're telling yourselves, that you haven't lost yourself. You are still that same person, and you haven't lost your future. Your future might look different, and you might look different, but you, at the core of you, you're still the same person, and you will be the same person through your life. And so it's that balancing of like a story you tell yourself about loss, and then what are the actual losses going to be? And can you kind of move between the two with a trusted companion, be that a doctor or a loved one or a friend or a community?
I often say that MS impacts families, not just individuals. And I'm wondering, how common is it for a care partner or any family member to experience grief during a loved one's MS journey?
Yeah, I would say that in the same ways that we tell ourselves stories, our partners are doing the same thing. And, the thing about the stories that we tell ourselves is that we often don't tell other people the stories that we are telling ourselves, and they are left to guess. So if you are frightened and scared that you are losing your future, your loved ones, all of the things that you hoped for, and then you are not telling your partner about that, then chances are you are not having connected, honest conversations with each other and or with your family. Maybe you think you're protecting them, but that protection and silence ends up creating a blockade for connection and then creates isolation. And I would say, as scary as it is for you to be going through this, it could also be scary for your loved ones, especially if they're feeling disconnected from you in that moment. And so really, the one way to overcome this sense of isolation, of disconnection, is to be brave enough to have an honest conversation. And what I like to tell my patients is, you are on a journey. You always have been on a journey. Maybe you didn't recognize you were on a journey, but the journey was called life. Now you're on another journey, or a second part of the journey, or a different phase of the journey, let's say. And this journey is, how do I move through MS? I just got this diagnosis. And if you are brave enough to invite your family on the journey with you, that really, really helps to mitigate the grief, the stories we tell ourselves, the things, our worst fears in our minds, and helps ground us in a sense of connection, solidarity, and a sense of just, let's be realistic and let's take this one step at a time, but at least we're on the journey together.
When people find themselves facing a difficult situation, it's not unusual to start bargaining with God or whatever that higher power may be for each of us.
Yeah.
If you just fix this, I promise I'll be in church every Sunday. I'll volunteer to work with people who are less fortunate than I'll donate money to charity. I think most of us are familiar with those kinds of bargains. And most of us are also familiar with the fact that today there is no cure for MS. So how can someone who's been diagnosed with MS best navigate the bargaining phase of grief and come to healthier terms with their diagnosis?
Yeah, faith and connection to a higher power are beautiful things. If that's something that has been part of your life and something that has given you hope and a sense of peace and a sense of community, then I would say, please continue to engage with that. And I would say also that volunteering your time and doing all those wonderful things that you mentioned, those are all things that actually can be very, very good for your body. Prayer, meditation, volunteering, thinking about others, these can often give us a really wonderful sense of peace. And when you are feeling peace, your stress levels go down. And when your stress levels go down, you feel more peace, and it ends up going in that direction. So that is just a really wonderful part about trying to engage with those facets of your life that are calming, that give you hope, that give you a sense of community. And so if that's what's, connecting with a higher power does for you, I think that's wonderful. As you mentioned, however, there is no cure at this point to MS, but we can help mitigate the disease. We can go see doctors and engage with therapy and try to build a community and really help our bodies. And I think that, a lot of people who believe in a higher power might not be surprised with this idea that we have this inner healer inside of us. All of us do. We just need to find ways to access it and to help us help ourselves. That looks different for every person. There is no one prescribed way of doing that. But that belief that the healing or the mitigation of MS is going to come from outside of you, I think is, something to think about in terms of seeing a doctor or taking a medication. But the real beauty of being a human is to find and access that piece of healing that's inside of you. It's a really amazing part about being human if you can find that. Yeah.
One of the challenges of living with MS is experiencing a relapse, which can serve to remind you that unfortunately, things can always get worse.
Yeah.
Just as a relapse can cause MS symptoms to worsen, can it also interfere with where you are in navigating grief? Can it set you back or otherwise impact the grieving process itself?
Yeah, for sure. It's a great question. I would say that, grief is by nature an iterative process. So even if you were grieving the loss of a person who is no longer here with us, even then the grief process tends to zigzag, ebb and flow. There is no, wow, I've arrived at this place on the beach and I'm so glad I'm here now. There is always, a pain of loss. And so, when a MS exacerbation or flare up occurs, it is a reminder. I'm human. I'm mortal. I have a disease. The disease is affecting me. And now what? And so, yes, you could have thought, gosh, I was in such a place of acceptance and peace. And here I am back at anger or frustration, or I wish this wasn't happening. Or, maybe if I just don't tell anybody that I'm feeling this symptom, maybe I could just, go on that trip that I had planned. I don't want to have to derail all my plans just because of this. So yes, for sure. Every time that we experience anything that reminds us of our loss, we will have to navigate again all the painful negative emotions we already navigated. But I would say every time we navigate painful emotions, if we are able to really sit with them, to move into them, to lean into them, even though it sounds terrible and it feels pretty terrible to be with all those negative emotions, that is the way that we move through them. And that every time we move in and through the scary stuff, the next time it happens, it's actually easier because we know we've done it before. I've done this before. It was hard. I didn't like it. I wish I didn't have to do this again, but I know I can survive. And that is a really wonderful, beautiful aspect of grief. You remind yourself, I can survive. I can survive this. I know how to survive it, and I will survive this.
It's estimated that about 50% of the people living with MS will at some point experience depression. How might depression affect grief? Can grief cause depression, or can depression cause or exacerbate grief?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. So, I'm a psychiatrist, and in psychiatry, there's grief and bereavement and there's depression. And it seems like they're these very separate things because they have different names and they have different diagnostic codes. And, we think about treating them differently. But psychiatry breaks up these human emotions, complex human emotions, into very simple sounding, discrete things that are actually not discrete at all. They're very, very similar. The difference between what I would call grief and then depression, or what might be a complicated bereavement, which is the movement of grief and bereavement into depression, is that grief can be a constellation of many, many symptoms. Sadness could be one of them. Anger could be one of them. Frustration. Depression is really sadness, guilt, difficulty sleeping, feelings of low self-worth. And then what I consider to be the most, dangerous of the depression symptoms would be thoughts of suicide. And so if you or a loved one, you suspect a loved one, are starting to have thoughts of suicide, even if it's, life isn't worth living and it's not, I want to end my life, but just, is life worth living? Life isn't worth living. That would be the warning sign that this has moved from grief into something more dangerous like depression, and that you need to seek out help. You need to tell somebody. You can't do this alone. Tell your doctor, tell your care team, find a psychiatrist, find a psychologist, but you need to take that first step in really saying, wow, something has transpired transpired here that is different, and it's scary. And I think I need to address this. It's moved beyond grief into depression.
Grief can also be accompanied by feelings of loneliness. Now, is loneliness something that can be diagnosed and treated?
Yeah. So, I mean, loneliness is kind of like MS, an invisible disease, or can be invisible disease for both of them. And in that way, it's often hard for others to know, in the same way that many patients who are diagnosed with MS say, nobody really knows because I look exactly the same, but I am not feeling the same at all. It's hard for us to know when people are lonely. People could be surrounded by loved ones, by coworkers, by family, friends, and be feeling very disconnected from others and very lonely. So it isn't, at this point, a disease that is diagnosable in our DSM, the manual that psychiatrists use to diagnose and treat diseases. But it can be treated by connection, by recognizing that you are starting to feel starved of connection, and that connection itself is what will help treat this. But it is scary. It's scary to talk about loneliness. It's scary to take that step. Often people become it's a strange thing to say, but people become comfortable in their loneliness. They're scared to say anything about it. They're scared that others might not understand. There's an ease about doing things in the same way over and over, even if it continues to create loneliness. So the very first step, once you've recognized that you are feeling lonely, is to really reach out to somebody. It's scary. You have to be brave to do it, but chances are that other person is feeling lonely as well, especially if it's somebody in your inner circle. If it's somebody in your community, they're probably feeling lonely too, because they are experiencing something very similar to you. So I would say, yes, loneliness is a real thing. It is a very, very difficult and often very negative state to be in. And the only real way in and through it is to seek out connections with others.
And as you pointed out, sometimes seeking those connections can be scary.
Yeah, for sure.
Some people are worried that it's going to make them look weak. What's the best way to have those kinds of conversations without feeling any shame?
Yeah, for sure. Shame is just one of those emotions that really holds power over people by keeping them silent. And so when you recognize that you might be ashamed to tell others that you are feeling lonely, that's when you need to really shine a light on shame and really recognize that in speaking whatever it is that is creating the shame, you are taking the power away from it, and you have the power now. Hopefully that power that you feel will allow you to reach out to others. As I said, it's really, you never know who is feeling lonely and who isn't. The people that you think, gosh, they must not feel lonely at all. Stars, for example, we have these ideas about mega stars, like, they're surrounded by all these admirers. They can't be feeling lonely, but oftentimes they are the loneliest. You know, the people who are surrounded by the most people are sometimes the loneliest. So I would really encourage people to really take that first step and be brave and see what happens, because chances are that person that you are talking to either is feeling that same loneliness, has felt that loneliness, or is connected to somebody who has felt the loneliness. I often like to tell my patients, try to imagine if your friend or colleague came to you and said to you this thing. In this case, I'm feeling really lonely. What would you say to them? How would you respond? Would you say, oh my gosh, that's so shameful. I can't believe you would be feeling that way. No, we would never say that. We would say, oh my gosh, I feel lonely as well. Or let's do this thing together. We are, human beings are designed to be social. We want to be social. We want to connect. And sometimes in our efforts to protect ourselves from negative emotions, we actually erect these barriers that protect us, but they end up creating isolation and loneliness. And it's only by really kind of getting rid of that protection. It feels scary. It is scary, but it's only by getting rid of that protection that we're really able to connect with others.
Dr. Holly Hendin, I want to thank you for all you do to improve the quality of life for people who are living with MS. And thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you about this important subject.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/374. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll visit the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free Real Talk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes, and it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.